Is Barbara Gervasi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kyle Hyland Foundation. I'm pleased to have with me tonight Jamey Eells-Booth and Melina Osmundson. They will be presenting tonight on teen dating violence within our community, specifically within the LGBTQIA plus community. We're so happy to have you here tonight with us, and thank you everyone for joining. And with that, I guess we can get started with the presentation.
All right, well, thanks, and welcome back everyone to the third evening of the Kyle Hyland Foundation's 5-day campaign focusing on teen dating violence. As Barb said, my name's Jamey Eells-Booth, and I'm the Youth Services Coordinator at Solano Pride Center. And part of my job at Solano Pride is providing cultural humility training on LGBT community to educators, administrators, and other LGBT youth serving professionals. It's my privilege to talk to you all tonight about teen dating violence and why it affects the LGBTQ community and its youth in particular at such higher rates, and to discuss some warning signs, some behaviors, and specifics to LGBT people. And helping me do that tonight is my wonderful co-host Melina, whom I'll let introduce themselves since I screwed this slide up.
No, you're fine. Hi, I'm Melina. I don't really have an official title, but I've been helping out at the Kyle Hyland Foundation since I was in high school. So that's how I got connected to Jamey and how I'm connected to this campaign. And not sure what else to add, but I'm really excited and honored to be doing this with Jamey. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, I think that when Melina and I were having these conversations, we were talking about February and we were like, okay, well, there's President's Day and there's of course Valentine's Day, and depending on how you feel about Valentine's Day, you know, it's also Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. And it's one of the hardest months of the year for us LGBTs because it's another month that highlights violence against and within our LGBT community. And it's just another facet of the overwhelming issues surrounding LGBT youth resiliency as a whole. You know, in the US and in fact all over the globe, LGBT people are disproportionately affected by all forms of violence, including teen dating and intimate partner violence. And some racial ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected by many types of violence at the same time. Racism, hate crimes, bias-based bullying, as well as teen dating and intimate partner violence disproportionately affects LGBT people. Specifically, disproportionately affects LGBT people of color across the spectrum and around the globe. It's a fact. With that being said, it's worth noting that tonight's discussion might mention suicide, violence, murder, racism, classism, and death. These topics can be triggering, and we hope that if you find yourself in crisis, you'll seek support. And when Melina is presenting, I will put a fantastic LGBT support line in the chat if you need immediate support. So what we've heard from other presenters this week is that our national statistics tells us that nearly 1.5 million high school students nationwide experience physical abuse from a dating partner in a single year. And of those surveyed, LGBT youth are disproportionately affected when compared to other heterosexual youth. We only know this is the case because national surveys and researchers only 3 decades ago, and only as a result of AIDS and HIV research, began collecting data, polling for LGBT experience and identity. Slowly, over the past 30 years, the LGBT community is being largely recognized as high risk and more likely than their heterosexual peers for some of the scariest human conditions we can think of. And you know, although teen dating violence has existed for probably as long as teens have existed. Teen dating violence is something that's only received national attention within the last 2 decades. Previous to that, teen dating violence was regarded, when it was regarded, as a private matter, not so important, and in regions with a strong religious presence, largely ignored romantic interactions between teenagers. And outside of sexual abstinence and pregnancy prevention programs being taught in public sex ed courses, teen dating violence was deemed inconsequential in many states and flew under the radar for years. In fact, regions with strong religious presence still affect some of our national data collection, as does political policies and state legislatures. It may not surprise some of you that a large majority of regions across the US, teen dating violence, let alone LGBT data, isn't collected. Some of the most common methods of gathering these statistics that inform the work of our nation's helping professionals, including myself, justice systems, healthcare providers, teachers, administrative staff, are through national surveys and polls like the ones that I've listed here. Where we place social consideration, money, and research dollars, it's largely driven by the statistics gathered by various national surveys, like the ones I've listed here. In the United States today, there remains a persistent lack of routine data collection on sexual orientation and gender identity, including the disparities that affect the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, or LGBT population, leaving the challenges facing us and our LGBT communities largely unmapped. If you ask, whom you ask, how comfortable or trusting that person is in answering, and how the questions are phrased, it all plays a part as to whether a person will answer a survey honestly, if at all. National surveys gathering youth risk behaviors still allow districts to opt out of LGBT affirming questions, and also questions regarding teen dating violence. But luckily, we can access the findings of hundreds of LGBT researchers and thousands of their peer-reviewed articles analyzing the data we do have from the statistics, from the data collection sources I've listed here, to help fill in the gaps and provide a narrative, and albeit incomplete, for our LGBT youth communities that we know have been suffering long before we knew they were suffering. Even with the lack of LGBT data collection, what's become consistently apparent over the last 20 years and recently in regard to teen dating violence and the LGBT community is that adult relationship and domestic violence has its roots grounded in unchecked teenage behavior. Surprise. For this reason, teenage dating violence has become an area of interest for researchers, and in my opinion, LGBT youth deserve a lot of that attention. Only because what the data and research on teen dating violence within the LGBT community tells us is also that it's interconnected, it's all interconnected and socially driven. The findings and numbers I'm sharing with you tonight are the compilation of national and privately funded youth and parent surveys and polls. What these national and private research data has given researchers is a fairly bleak narrative of the LGBT community and has shown us the LGBT youth sit at the top of some pretty scary lists of more than likelies. And even with the lack of data, these are what the numbers are telling us, and these are just a few of the most challenging disparities that affect the LGBT youth population 0 to 24, and are causative factors, believe it or not, surrounding intimate partner violence within the LGBT community. Did you all know that suicide's the second leading cause of death among people ages 10 to 24? And the LGBT adolescents have the highest rate of suicide attempts? LGB youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of a heterosexual youth, and transgendered youth are 2 times more likely than their LGB peers. The report of the US Transgender Survey found that 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt, and 92% of those individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. And according to the American Association of Suicidology, scientific research indicates homophobic attitudes, heterosexist discrimination, continuing political attacks on civil rights of LGBT people, and contemporary efforts to marginalize and oppress play a significant role in these disparities. The American Journal of Public Health tells us each episode of LGBT plus victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, like teen dating violence, increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. Sorry, y'all. According to the National Coalition for the Homelessness, Williams Institute, UCLA, National Alliance to End Homelessness, each year an estimated 4.2 million youth and young adults experience homelessness, of which 700,000 are unaccompanied minors, and that's without parents. And of those, 11 to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. 58% of those who identify as LGBT have been sexually victimized. LGBT homeless youth are 7.4 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence while homeless. LGBT homeless youth commit suicide at 62.5% compared to heterosexual homeless youth at 29%. The 3 most common reasons cited among LGBT youth for becoming homeless are running away from families who reject them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, being forced out of their homes after disclosing their identities, and aging out of or running away from the foster care system and the possible violence towards LGBT youth that can occur there. And that's a whole nother conversation. CSEX stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. And our national surveys tell us that every year approximately 100,000 to 300,000 children become victims of commercial sexual exploitation. While trafficking affects all demographics, traffickers frequently target individuals who lack strong support networks, are facing financial strains, have experienced violence in the past, or who are already marginalized by society. Without adequate community support, youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning may be at a particular risk for sex trafficking. According to the Polaris Project, who works specifically with CSEC youth, LGBT children and adults are more often and more easily compelled into sex trafficking in the US. Their findings show that 27% of LGBTQIA youth who are homeless reported exchanging sex for basic needs, compared to 9% of non-LGBTQ youth who were homeless who reported having to exchange sex for basic needs. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, 1 in 3 teens on the street will be lured into prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. And that LGBT youth are 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex to meet basic needs such as shelter, food, drugs, toiletries. The CDC tells us that an estimated 60,000 youth have HIV, representing 4% of all people with HIV, and their studies show that the number is climbing. The CDC tells us that 1 in 4 new HIV infections occur in youth between the ages of 12 to 24. They also tell us that young people account for a substantial portion of new STIs, within gonorrhea, chlamydia, and HPV is the most common. Of those infected youth, an estimated 56% were aware of their infection. The CDC found that young people were the least likely to be aware of their infection compared to any age group. And that overall, gay men and trans women, specifically gay men of color and trans women of color, are most at risk for HIV and AIDS. And do you know that out of almost 15,000 students surveyed on the most recent Youth Risk Behavior Survey, those who identify as LGBTQ more often reported having been bullied on school property in the past year, reported being cyberbullied in the past year, and reported not going to school because of safety concerns. About 1 in 6 students who had expressed their gender in a way that was different from their sex assigned at birth stopped going to school for a period of time due to harassment. And almost half of that group experienced homelessness as well. And you know what, Melina, like we were talking about, the really heartbreaking part for me is that on average, about 1 in 20 students in the US were afraid to go to school at least once in the past month. And that's prior to COVID. But bullying continues throughout COVID. And do you know that this rises to 1 in 15 for Black and Hispanic students and to 1 in 10 for students who identify as LGBT, or as the survey categorizes it, who are not sure of their sexual identity. And you can't see me right now, but I'm doing air quotes. The National Alliance on Mental Illness points out that LGBTQ individuals are 3 times more likely than others to experience a mental health condition such as major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. Of course, LGBT homeless youth are more likely than their homeless heterosexual counterparts to have poorer mental health and physical health outcomes, including major depressive disorders, PTSD, and substance abuse issues. Most research by psychologists and other mental health professionals conclude that fear of coming out and being discriminated against for sexual orientation and gender identities can lead to depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, thoughts of suicide and substance abuse. And almost unanimously, researchers concluded that LGBT people are 3 times more likely than others to experience a mental health condition because they must confront stigma and prejudice based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, while also dealing with a societal bias against mental health conditions as a whole. With the lack of LGBT inclusive data until recently, poverty and how it affects the LGBT community is relatively a new ground of research. And I think with more and more federal and state institutions adopting more inclusive and affirming institutional policies and asking the questions, we're beginning to see another area where LGBT people are disproportionately affected. Until just recently, only 20 states and the District of Columbia prohibited discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 18 states had no laws prohibiting workplace discrimination against LGBT people, and many states still uphold a provider's religious right to refuse service to LGBT people, and it's not just cakes that they refuse. And even though environmental studies show that a lack of LGBT affirming and inclusive workplaces and insufficient institutional rules makes it especially difficult for LGBT people to succeed economically and come out of poverty. We know this because we've asked questions as a nation and we have the numbers in front of us. And what we see is that LGBT and transgender individuals report having been refused a home or apartment and report being evicted because their sexuality, gender identity, or expression. And again, it's worth noting that transgender people of color are the most affected and consistently below poverty thresholds on national poverty index reports. This data, and of course the other data, substantiates all the data within all the other fields of LGBT research, like the ones I've mentioned so far. So let's talk about the research on teen dating and intimate partner violence and what the research has told us. When examined in the context of intimate partner violence, the statistics we've just talked about are large warning signs in and of themselves for teen dating violence. By and large, across all surveys, higher shares of LGBTQ youth reported more victimization experiences of cyber dating abuse, physical dating violence, psychological dating abuse, and sexual coercion compared to other heterosexual youth. Higher shares of LGBT youth reported perpetrating cyber dating abuse, physical dating violence, and physical dating abuse. Experts agree that abuse by intimate partners could lead to already depressed LGBT teens to harm themselves, cause healthy LGBT teens to become depressed, or lead to homelessness, bullying, sex trafficking, mental health conditions, and worse, suicide ideation and/or successful suicide. Did I mention this was all interconnected? The most common conclusions, I guess, experts have agreed upon as to the why LGBT youth are disproportionately affected by teen dating and intimate partner violence probably won't surprise any of you, but all of these reasons that I've mentioned so far are what studies have shown put LGBT people, and specifically youth, in this particular more than likely. The most common conclusions experts agreed upon and the reasons they're disproportionately affected, and what they've specifically found probably won't surprise you. LGBTQ teens may have trouble recognizing that they are victims of teen dating violence, even when the battering is severe, because intimate partner violence is commonly defined and discussed within a heterosexual context. Rarely do school-based sex education classes or healthy relationship instruction contain or mention LGBT-specific information. And rarely is teen dating or intimate partner violence discussed beyond the heteronormative. Most studies have shown if teens are living in a household that isn't affirming of LGBT people, LGBT teens are less likely to approach their parent or guardian when experiencing violence and are less likely to discuss healthy relationships as it pertains to them as an LGBT person. Researchers also found that if teens are living in a community that isn't affirming, inclusive, or tolerant of LGBT people, being open about their sexual orientation and/or gender identity might prevent access to protection and resources. It may also put them in danger of other types of violence. For example, victims might say, stay with their abuser because the victim's parents are homophobic and the victims feel they cannot turn to their family for support and they don't know of any other LGBT inclusive organization in their small little town where they can seek help. Related to that are the available protections and resources an LGBT experiencing teen dating violence has at their disposal at any given county in any given state. Even a county this close to the Bay Area, we still have inadequate services that affirm, include, and focus on LGBT youth-specific needs, especially if that youth is transgender. Some LGBT victims of teen dating violence say they feel too afraid to tell others about their abuse because doing so would out or expose themselves and/or their partners as LGBTQ in environments that they perceive to be hostile towards LGBT individuals. Being out in every system, including family, friends, school, and work, is less likely when environments are hostile or unaffirming. In as many cases and studies not related to this, but related to mental health, will tell you, in order to self-actualize as a human, we need to be congruent, and that is to say we need to be ourselves in every system, like our families, work, home, our religious communities. And fear of being outed, this one's hard because it complicates teen dating violence and LGBT intimate partnerships in a way that heterosexual teens don't experience. Teen dating violence perpetrators may use outing as a method of coercion. For example, in a well-known study of like 521 youth attending an LGBT rally, researchers found that bisexual males, who incidentally bisexuals make up the largest part of the LGBT community, that bisexual males had over 5 times the odds of gay males for being threatened to be outed by a partner. And bisexual females had over 5 times the odds of lesbians for being threatened to be outed by a partner. It should come as no surprise to you that transgender teens may be even more fearful of outing than their LGB peers, because transgender youth report much higher rates of harassment and assault than cisgendered male and female peers. And now, Melina, I think that's where you're going to pick up. Melina's going to talk more about the additional barriers and the behaviors and the warning signs and specifics to the LGBT community regarding teen dating violence.
Sorry, okay. Is it showing up or no?
It was.
Yes, it absolutely is.
Oh, it is? Okay, sorry, I haven't done this before. Okay.
You're doing beautifully, thank you.
So you guys can see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I focused more, like, there's not any cool images, but I want it to be more text-based. So basically, first, I'm going to be talking about specific, like, toxic behaviors in relationships, specifically LGBT plus intimate relationships. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is love bombing. And so as you can see, the definition of love bombing is on the screen, but how it relates specifically to the LGBT community is, okay, so you know how Jamie was talking about how partners can try and use coercion to try to out you. And so in the beginning of a relationship, they might offer you like gifts and shelter and a place to stay. And especially if you have a homophobic family, and then try to use that as a way to control you, like by saying you can't leave me, or I have power over you because of these things I provided for you. So that's basically in a nutshell what love bombing is. It's trying to use a benefit to control someone. As well as possessiveness, that they kind of go hand in hand. These are, yeah, that's basically it. Possessiveness obviously kind of does go hand in hand with what love bombing is. Just trying to use like a facade of good behavior and trying to win someone over and using that to control you. So then leading into that is what this kind of behavior can lead to. So this can lead to sexual assault, physical violence, murder, and these are just some statistics. I have more as well. but the biggest thing I think that Jamey and I were just trying to get across is that of course this happens to everyone, not just in the LGBT community. Intimate partner violence, sexual assault, physical violence, murder, obviously. But when you look at the statistics, it's happening more in the community. And a lot of times, obviously I'll get into the warning signs too, but that type of behavior is what is a warning sign of what this is. Also, as Jamey was saying, how people of color are systematically more affected, especially in the community. And like a month in a survey in 2015, American Indian, 65% American Indian, 59% multiracial, 58% Middle Eastern, and 53% Black respondents of a transgender survey in 2015 were most likely to have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. So it disproportionately affects people of color, not just sexual assault, but violence in general in the community. So the warning signs to look for are pretty generic. However, obviously they're generic, but the point I kind of wanted to touch on is, even though they're generic signs, they still are something that I feel like do get overlooked in the LGBT community because of the reasons that Jamey was saying. How a lot of times it's not reported because someone doesn't want to be outed, they don't want to out their partner, their family wouldn't understand. So a lot of times these signs might just get overlooked. And like also like Jamey was saying, that LGBT youth don't even know they're a victim. So they might just accept these things, even though these are still warning signs. And then this is also, these are signs that we've been talking about all week as well. But yeah, and then things to look for in a healthy relationship. Again, stuff we've been talking about all week, but I feel like a lot of times LGBT youth might not prioritize these things because of the things like Jamey was saying, like not being able to be out and have that guidance from family, a trusted adult, etc. So sometimes they may accept something toxic and violent in a toxic relationship rather than a healthy one because of their situation and circumstances. So these are just reiterating what to look for and what you deserve. And yeah, let me go back. Okay. Sorry, I'm like really nervous, so.
No, you did wonderfully. Thank you so much. I think that the thing that I should have started off with was a disclaimer that I am a cursor. I don't know if I made it through tonight's presentation without cursing. I'm also a spontaneous crier when things are very personal to me. And everything that I talked about tonight was very personal to me. In fact, everything I talked about tonight kind of contextualizes my entire life's experience, but that's not uncommon in our community. And I really think that if people knew just the absurd rates of kids out there that are being affected by some of this stuff, especially teen dating violence, you know, and you hit it right on the head. And I think specifically for me, sometimes we think any type of love is better than no love at all. And then the question is, can you be afraid of people that you love? You know, in the bigger, I guess, picture, everyone can be afraid of the people that we love. I mean, if you think about it, who wasn't afraid of their parent at one point, and we still love them? But unfortunately, when we're talking about teen dating violence and intimate partner violence, we're not talking about the type of love parents and or guardians, you know, have for their children. or are supposed to have for their children. So what I've done for you here is offer you any type of questions you might have. Maybe we can talk more about this. I've listed in the chat some of those hotlines and support lines that I mentioned. But I'd really love to take any questions you all have. If you want to say something, not required. If you'd rather email me, I've put my email up here, and that's my work number. Please call me during the daylight time. And we also, I've listed Solano Pride Center's website and telephone number, the Kyle Hyland Foundation's website and telephone numbers, Benicia Teen Center landline. Our hope is that if any of these things are affecting you in any way, or that you know people who are being affected in these ways, is that you'll reach out to someone that can help. And the numbers I've listed here, we know how to find you help. You know, as an LGBT person, it's hard to trust people. And I feel that sometimes we have the ability to advocate more for others than we do for ourselves. And in my case, I know that's the fact. It's very easy for me to look at numbers usually and say, okay, these are numbers. But like we were saying at the beginning of this program, when you know people, specific people behind some of these statistics, it becomes an entirely different universe. And if you're related to anyone behind these statistics, it can become your universe. It is overwhelming to think about the numbers, because again, the numbers and the statistics that we use to frame our work, those are just people that we're willing to answer honestly, you know, and that comes with a sense of trust. So if there aren't any more questions, I just want to say thank you. And I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of this fantastic campaign. And by fantastic, I mean fantastically ran. Barb, I want to thank you for allowing me an opportunity to you know, talk and to spread the word. And at least make it, you know, I believe in ripples in a pond, and make it a little easier for all of us to provide a ripple if we can just talk about this, any part of this, all of it, teen dating violence, any part of this. If you just talk with one more person about it, job done, easy. Easy. So thanks, Barb, for allowing me to skip my stone in your pond. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jamey. We're so happy to have you and share your expertise and all of your facts. And it was a great presentation, very interesting, very compelling. I know about a lot of these statistics, and I wasn't sure of all of the reasons why the LGBTQIA plus community was so impacted. That was really, really interesting to me and very valuable for me to learn the reasons why. Some of them are obvious, but then others are maybe not quite so obvious to someone like me anyway. So thank you so much, Jamey, and thank you so much, Melina.
Hi, I wanted to say real quick. Sorry, this isn't like something I do a lot, so it's kind of a learning curve for me, but I'm just really glad I was able to be a part of this, because like Jamey was saying, same for me, it's a very personal subject. So any way I can contribute and help just means a lot to me. And especially because I feel like with the LGBT community, you know, somewhat the stigma is being taken away. I say somewhat, like there's more acceptance, but in a way, a lot of the issues that are still in the community aren't talked about the way they need to be, especially the violence and danger that is still rampant, especially even more so trans women of color, like that. is at the forefront, in my opinion. Not in my opinion, it's a fact. So being able to talk about it and bring awareness in any way, I really appreciate it. So thank you.